The autumn chill had settled over Charlotte earlier than usual that year. Crimson and amber leaves skittered across Wilton Avenue, a respectable street of modest homes where neighbors still knew each other's business, for better or worse. Number 147, with its white painted porch and neatly tended flower beds, belonged to John and Annie Starnes, a retired couple whose Sunday picnics had been a neighborhood fixture for nearly 2 decades. It was Mrs. Clarence from across the street who first noticed something amiss. The Starnes curtains remained drawn well past noon on a Tuesday in October 1956, and Annie had missed their standing appointment at the hairdresser's. Mrs. Clarence later told police that she'd knocked on the door 3 times before trying the handle. It wasn't like the Starnes to leave their door unlocked, but there it was, yielding to her touch. The smell hit her first. Something wrong. Something metallic and sharp that didn't belong in the tidy home of a couple known for Annie's immaculate housekeeping. Mrs. Clarence would later describe to anyone who would listen how she'd called out their names before finding Annie in the kitchen, her body splayed awkwardly beside the refrigerator, the marks of strangulation visible on her neck, her eyes still open in surprise. John was in the living room, face down on the braided rug his wife had made 3 winters ago, the fireplace poker lying bloody beside his battered head. Detective Howard Mills was having coffee at Denny's when the call came in. At 43, he'd seen his share of domestic disputes turn deadly, but the Starnes case struck him differently from the start. A plate of untouched food sat on the dining table, the roast beef and potatoes arranged with care. No signs of forced entry. Nothing obviously missing. The couple's modest savings remained in the dresser drawer upstairs, and Annie's wedding ring was still on her finger. They knew whoever did this, Mills told his partner, Frank Dolan, a younger man with a quick temper and quicker instincts. Look at the table. She'd set an extra place. Could be the daughter. Miriam, right? Dolan suggested, jotting notes in his small leather-bound notebook. Where is she now? Atlanta. Already confirmed with her employer that she was at work yesterday. She's driving up now, should be here by evening. Mills crouched beside John Starnes' body, studying the wounds. Multiple blows. Anger here. This wasn't just a burglary gone wrong. The living room bore signs of a struggle, an overturned side table, a broken lamp, a scatter of photographs that had been knocked from the mantel. One photo caught Mills' eye, John Starnes standing proudly outside a small church, his arm around a much younger man in semi-formal attire. The detective pocketed it without quite knowing why. News of the murders spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. By afternoon, a small crowd had gathered behind the police line, murmuring theories and sharing stories about the couple who had been fixtures in the community since before the war. They were good Christians, Mrs. Henley from 2 doors down insisted. Never missed a Sunday service. Who would want to hurt them? Another neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Peter Garvey, mentioned that he'd seen someone unfamiliar that morning. A tall fellow in a trench coat, hanging around the back gate. Couldn't see his face clearly, but he didn't belong here. I almost said something, but, he shrugged, his face creased with regret. Mills interviewed 17 neighbors that day. The description of the man in the trench coat was consistent but frustratingly vague. Tall. Dark hat. Collar turned up. Clean-shaven, probably. No one recognized him from the description, and no one could say for certain what time he'd appeared or disappeared. When Miriam Starnes arrived from Atlanta, her grief was palpable but controlled. A woman in her early 30s with her mother's delicate features but her father's sturdy build, she sat rigidly in the police station's interview room, her gloved hands clasped tightly on the table. I spoke to them Sunday night, she said, her voice steady. Everything was normal. Dad was excited about some new project at the church. Mom was planning her garden for next spring. Did they mention having any visitors coming? Mills asked gently. Miriam shook her head. They weren't expecting me until Thanksgiving. And they didn't entertain much these days, not since Dad's heart scare last year. What about enemies? Anyone who might have held a grudge? A flicker of something, hesitation, crossed Miriam's face. My parents were kind people, detective. Everyone loved them. Mrs. Reynolds, Mills used her married name deliberately. In my experience, even the kindest people can make enemies without realizing it. She sighed, removing her gloves methodically, finger by finger. There was a handyman last summer. Dad caught him stealing some tools and fired him on the spot. And there was a young man who rented their spare room briefly 2 years ago. Left suddenly, owing them money. Mills made notes. Names. The handyman was Elias Tucker. Local man. The lodger. Luke or Liam, I think. Something with an L. I never met him. The next morning, Mills and Dolan split up to track down these leads. Dolan went looking for Elias Tucker while Mills visited First Presbyterian, where John Starnes had been an elder for over 15 years. The church was quiet on a Wednesday morning, sunlight streaming through stained glass, casting colored patterns across empty pews. Reverend Thomas Whitaker received Mills in his office, a small space lined with theological texts and smelling faintly of pipe tobacco. John was like a brother to me, the Reverend said, his voice catching. This community has lost a pillar. I understand he was working on a project here. Mills prompted. Whitaker nodded. The youth center. John was heading the fundraising committee. We're renovating the old parish hall, making it into a proper recreation space for the neighborhood children. John was passionate about it. Was there any disagreement about this project? Any opposition? The Reverend hesitated. Not officially, no. Though between us, not everyone on the church board thought it was the best use of funds. Some wanted to renovate the sanctuary first. He lowered his voice. But no one would harm John over something like that. It's unthinkable. As Mills was leaving, he showed the photograph he'd taken from the Starnes mantel. Do you recognize this young man with Mr. Starnes? Whitaker studied it, nodding slowly. That's Calvin Fletcher. He was like a son to John for a while. Troubled boy from a difficult home. John took him under his wing about 5 years ago, got him a job at the hardware store. Are they still close? No, the Reverend said, his expression clouding. There was some unpleasantness. Calvin left town rather suddenly about 2 years ago. I haven't heard of him since. Mills felt a familiar tingle of intuition. Would this Calvin have been renting a room from the Starneses around that time? Whitaker's surprise confirmed it before he spoke. Yes, now that you mention it. John offered him their spare room when Calvin lost his apartment. How did you know? Back at the station, Mills found Dolan looking frustrated. Elias Tucker has an ironclad alibi. He's been in Virginia visiting his sister for the past week. Multiple witnesses confirm it. Mills shared what he'd learned about Calvin Fletcher. Let's find out what happened between him and Starnes. Their search for Calvin Fletcher hit immediate roadblocks. No current address, no employment records in the state for the past 2 years. It was as if he'd disappeared after leaving Charlotte. 3 days into the investigation, a promising lead emerged from an unexpected source. A drifter named Raymond Moss was arrested for a burglary in Gaston County, just west of Charlotte. During questioning, he confessed to several break-ins in the area over the past month. Could be our guy, Dolan said excitedly. Fits the general description of the man in the trench coat. Mills was skeptical. The Starnes murder doesn't fit the pattern of a typical burglary. Nothing valuable was taken. Nevertheless, they drove to Gaston County to interview Moss, a gaunt man with nervous hands and bloodshot eyes. He readily admitted to the burglaries but vehemently denied any involvement in the murders. I ain't never killed nobody, he insisted, his voice shaking. I take things, sure, but I don't hurt people. I wait till houses are empty. Mills studied him carefully. Where were you on Tuesday morning, between 7 and 9 a.m.? Sleeping in my car out by Lake Norman. I was planning my next job for that night. You can ask the ranger who rousted me around 10. The ranger confirmed Moss's story, and physical evidence from the Starnes home, partial fingerprints that didn't match Moss, shoe size impressions that were too small, further cleared him. Another dead end. Meanwhile, the press had gotten hold of the story. The Charlotte Observer ran a front-page piece, "Beloved couple murdered in their home, community in shock." The article painted a glowing portrait of John and Annie Starnes, pillars of the community whose lives had been cut short by a senseless act of violence. Mills found himself increasingly drawn to the mystery of Calvin Fletcher. A visit to the hardware store where the young man had worked yielded little new information, except that he'd been fired for showing up drunk once too often. The store owner, Walter Briscoe, remembered him as bright but unstable. "John Starnes vouched for him when I hired him," Briscoe said, arranging paintbrushes on a display rack. "I wouldn't have taken a chance on him otherwise. John saw something in that boy worth saving." "Do you know why Calvin left town?" Briscoe's mouth tightened. There were rumors. Nothing concrete. Something about money going missing from the church building fund. Some said Calvin took it and John covered for him. Others said they had a falling out over a woman. Small town talk, you know how it is. A week into the investigation, Miriam Starnes requested a meeting with Mills. She'd been staying in her parents' house, despite Mills' suggestion that she find a hotel room instead. "I found something," she said without preamble, placing a small leather-bound journal on his desk. "My father's diary. He kept it in his bedside drawer." Mills opened it carefully. The entries were sporadic, sometimes weeks apart, written in a neat, precise hand. He skimmed through mundane observations about weather, church events, and garden progress until an entry from 18 months earlier caught his eye. March 12, 1955, loaned CF $2,000 for his business idea. "Annie thinks I'm too trusting, but the boy deserves a chance. He reminds me of myself at that age. Besides, we have enough saved for our needs." Several entries later. June 8, 1955, CF missed another payment. "That's 3 now. Says the business is struggling but will turn around soon. Beginning to wonder if Annie was right." And finally, from August 1955. August 23, confronted CF about the money. "Ugly scene. Things said that can't be unsaid. He left, taking some of our silver and Annie's mother's brooch. Won't tell Annie about the theft. She's been through enough disappointment with him." Mills looked up at Miriam. "CF is Calvin Fletcher, I assume?" She nodded. "I never met him, but Mom mentioned him in her letters. Said Dad had adopted another stray. That was her way of describing the young people Dad was always trying to help." $2,000 is a substantial loan, Mills observed. "It was most of their savings," Miriam confirmed, her voice tight with anger. "Dad's pension only went so far. They were counting on that money for their retirement. Your father never reported the theft?" She shook her head. "That wasn't his way. He believed in second chances. In redemption." Her voice broke slightly on the last word. Mills spent the next day searching for any trace of Calvin Fletcher. A check of regional arrest records turned up a drunk and disorderly charge in Raleigh 4 months earlier, with an address at a boarding house. The lead was thin, but it was all they had. The boarding house was a shabby 3-story building in a declining neighborhood. The landlady, Mrs. Peabody, remembered Fletcher. Quiet tenant. Paid late but always paid. Left about 3 weeks ago, said he'd be back for his things but never showed. She let them into his room, a sparse space containing a narrow bed, a chipped dresser, and a desk covered with papers. Most of the papers were job applications and rejection letters. A half-finished letter caught Mills' attention. "Dear Mr. Starnes, I know it's been a long time, and you probably never want to hear from me again. I don't blame you. What I did was unforgivable. But I've changed. I've been sober for 6 months now, and I'm working steady at the The letter ended there, never completed, never sent. In the dresser drawer, beneath a stack of shirts, Mills found a newspaper clipping about the Church Youth Center project in Charlotte, with John Starnes' photo circled in pencil. He was keeping tabs on the old man, Dolan observed. Or looking for a way to make amends, Mills countered, not sure why he was playing devil's advocate. Their search also uncovered a bus ticket to Charlotte, dated for the weekend before the murders, and a pawn ticket for a silver brooch. Mills pocketed both. At the pawn shop across town, the owner confirmed that Calvin Fletcher had indeed pawned a vintage silver brooch several months earlier but had returned to reclaim it just last week. Paid cash, the pawnbroker said. Seemed real determined to get it back. Said it was a family heirloom he never should have parted with. Mills felt the case beginning to take shape. A young man who had stolen from his benefactors returns to town with the pawned brooch, perhaps intending to make amends or ask for more money. A confrontation turns violent. But something still didn't sit right. Why kill Annie? Mills mused aloud as they drove back to Charlotte. If this was about money or a dispute with John, why harm her too? Maybe she walked in on them arguing, Dolan suggested. Became a witness who needed silencing. 2 weeks after the murders, with pressure mounting from the press and the public for an arrest, Mills received a call from a gas station attendant 20 miles outside Charlotte. "I think I saw that fellow you're looking for," the man said. "The one from the newspaper. Tall guy, nervous-like. Paid for gas with a handful of change and asked for directions to the bus station." Mills and Dolan arrived at the Greyhound station just as a bus was preparing to depart for Cincinnati. A quick scan of the waiting passengers revealed no one matching Calvin Fletcher's description, but the ticket agent remembered him. "Left an hour ago. Different bus. Headed for Atlanta." Mills immediately called the Atlanta police, providing Fletcher's description and requesting they meet the bus upon arrival. 6 hours later, he received confirmation: Calvin Fletcher was in custody. Mills and Dolan drove through the night to reach Atlanta by morning. At the police station, they found Fletcher in an interrogation room, looking exhausted and resigned. At 30, he appeared older, with premature lines etched around his eyes and mouth, his brown hair thinning at the temples. "I didn't kill them," were his first words when Mills entered the room. "I loved them. They were the only real family I ever had." "Then why run?" Mills asked, taking a seat across from him. Fletcher's eyes filled with tears. "Because I knew how it would look. Ex-con returns to town, his benefactors end up dead. I knew you'd suspect me." "Ex-con." This was new information. Fletcher nodded wearily. "Served 18 months for fraud before I met John. He knew about it, gave me a chance anyway. No one else would." Over the next 3 hours, Fletcher's story emerged in fragments. He had indeed returned to Charlotte the weekend before the murders, staying at a cheap motel under a false name. "I wanted to make things right," he insisted. "I'd been sober for months, had a decent job in Raleigh. I saved up enough to buy back Annie's brooch and make a first payment on what I owed John." "So you went to see them Tuesday morning?" Mills pressed. Fletcher shook his head vehemently. "Monday evening. Around 7. We talked for hours. John was cautious at first, but he warmed up. Annie made coffee. I gave her the brooch, and she cried." His voice cracked with emotion. "They invited me to stay for dinner the next night. Said we had more to talk about. And Tuesday? I never made it. I overslept, then got cold feet. By the time I worked up the courage to go, it was past noon. There were police cars everywhere." He buried his face in his hands. "I panicked. Grabbed my things from the motel and fled. Been running ever since." "That's convenient," Dolan said skeptically. "No one can verify your whereabouts during the time of the murders." "The motel clerk might remember me," Fletcher said desperately. "I was in room 14 at the Wayfair Inn." I didn't check out until almost noon. Mills had the alibi checked immediately. The night clerk at the Wayfaring confirmed that Fletcher had returned to his room around midnight on Monday and had been seen by the maid who brought fresh towels around 10 a.m. Tuesday. Not ironclad, but it created reasonable doubt. If not you, then who? Mills asked, genuinely perplexed. Who else had a motive to harm the Starneses? Fletcher hesitated. There was something off about John when I saw him Monday. He seemed worried. When Annie went to the kitchen, he mentioned that he'd discovered something disturbing at the church, his exact words. Said he needed to speak to the board about it urgently. Mills remembered his conversation with Reverend Whitaker about opposition to the youth center. Was there more to that story? Upon returning to Charlotte, Mills dug deeper into the church's affairs. The youth center project had indeed caused friction, particularly with Harold Deacon, a wealthy church board member who had wanted the funds directed elsewhere. Further investigation revealed that Deacon's construction company had been tentatively awarded the renovation contract, despite submitting a bid significantly higher than competitors. John was on the selection committee, Reverend Whitaker confirmed when Mills inquired. He'd been asking questions about the bidding process recently, requested to see all the paperwork. A check of Deacon's whereabouts the morning of the murders revealed that he had cancelled a long-standing breakfast meeting at the last minute. His secretary noted it was unusual, as Mr. Deacon never cancelled anything. Mills had just enough to bring Deacon in for questioning, but not enough for an arrest. The interview was tense, with Deacon's high-priced lawyer present throughout. Deacon denied any impropriety in the bidding process and expressed shock and dismay at the insinuation he might be involved in the Starnes' deaths. I was at home that morning, feeling under the weather, he insisted. My wife can confirm it. She did, though Mills noted a strange reticence in her manner. Fear, perhaps. The case against Deacon stalled for lack of evidence. No murder weapon could be tied to him, and no physical evidence placed him at the scene. His wife's testimony, though possibly coerced, provided an alibi that would be difficult to break in court. Calvin Fletcher was released but remained under suspicion. The man in the trench coat was never identified conclusively. Raymond Moss was convicted of his burglaries but maintained his innocence regarding the murders. 3 months after the murders, the Starnes case went cold. Mills continued to work it in his spare time, convinced that the answer lay somewhere in the church's financial records or in the mysterious project John Starnes had been concerned about. But concrete evidence remained elusive. The Starnes' home was sold the following year to a young family new to Charlotte. They gutted the interior, erasing the physical reminders of the tragedy that had occurred there. Life on Wilton Avenue gradually returned to normal, though neighbors would still lower their voices when passing number 147. Miriam Starnes Reynolds returned to Atlanta, carrying her father's journal and unanswered questions. She wrote to Mills occasionally, asking for updates that he couldn't provide. Decades passed. Mills retired, then died of a heart attack in 1973. Frank Dolan rose through the ranks to become police commissioner, and the Starnes case became a teaching tool at the academy, an example of a seemingly straightforward crime that defied resolution. In 1992, during renovations at First Presbyterian, workers discovered a hidden compartment in the wall of the church office, containing financial records that hadn't been seen in nearly 40 years. Among them was a folder labeled Youth Center Discrepancies, filled with meticulously documented evidence of embezzlement and bid rigging. John Starnes' handwriting filled the margins with notes and questions. By then, Harold Deacon had been dead for 15 years, taking whatever secrets he possessed to his grave. His construction company had long since been sold, and his widow had moved to Florida. Today, the Starnes case remains in the archives of North Carolina's oldest unsolved murders. Theories abound: a drifter passing through, a handyman with a grudge, a troubled young man returning to confront his benefactor, a respected businessman protecting his reputation, or someone else entirely, their motive lost to time. On Wilton Avenue, few residents now remember the couple who once hosted Sunday picnics in their backyard. The house has changed hands many times since, its tragic history fading with each new coat of paint. But in a small corner of the Charlotte Police Department's cold case files, the photographs of John and Annie Starnes still look out from their manila folder, their eyes asking the question that has never been answered: who ended their lives on that autumn morning in 1956, and why? Perhaps the only people who know the full truth are those who cannot speak, the victims themselves, and whoever walked away from 147 Wilton Avenue that October day, carrying a secret that has endured for generations.